September 28th, 1994, 1:15 in the morning. The Baltic Sea, somewhere between Tallinn, Estonia, and Stockholm, Sweden. A metal locking mechanism holding shut a giant steel door at the front of a car ferry finally gives way after hours of being hammered by waves. The door, the bow visor, tears completely off the ship. Seawater pours directly onto the car deck, hundreds of tons of it in seconds. The ship begins to list, then roll, then capsize completely. In under an hour, the MV Estonia is gone. 852 people are dead. Only 137 survive. It is the worst peacetime maritime disaster in European history. And the part almost nobody outside Scandinavia knows is this. The law now forbids anyone from diving down to find out exactly what really happened. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. For hours before the visor failed completely, crew members heard loud banging noises coming from the bow. Metallic. Repeated. Loud enough that multiple people mentioned it. Nobody investigated. The ship kept her speed in rough seas that should have demanded slowing down. The captain did not reduce engine power. Nobody walked forward to check the visor with their own eyes. When the locks finally failed, there was no time left to react. The flooding was so fast, and the ship's design so vulnerable to exactly this kind of failure that the entire vessel rolled onto its side in minutes. And in 1995, the governments of Estonia, Finland, and Sweden signed a formal agreement. They declared the wreck a protected grave site. Diving without special permission became a criminal act. For decades, almost nobody was legally allowed to look. 3 things about the Estonia disaster that the official investigation never fully resolved. The first, this exact failure, a bow visor tearing away in heavy seas, had already happened to a similar ferry, the Herald of Free Enterprise, 7 years earlier in 1987. That disaster killed 193 people. The lesson should have been learned. The locking mechanisms on ferries, like the Estonia, were known within the industry to be a weak point. Nothing was meaningfully redesigned in time. The second, the official investigation concluded the visor locks simply failed under wave stress. But in 2019, divers working secretly for a Discovery Channel documentary crew found something the official report never mentioned. A hole in the ship's hull, roughly 4 meters wide, in a section that should have been intact if the visor was the only point of failure. The discovery triggered a renewed criminal investigation in 3 countries. The third, for years before the disaster, persistent rumors circulated in Scandinavian military and intelligence circles that ferries on this exact route were sometimes used to move Soviet-era military equipment out of the newly independent Baltic states. Whether the Estonia was carrying anything unusual that night has never been conclusively proven. It has also never been conclusively ruled out. The MV Estonia was built in 1980 at a German shipyard, originally for a different operator, before being sold and reflagged multiple times through the 1980s and early 1990s. The Estonia had passed through several owners and names since her construction at a German shipyard in 1980, eventually settling into service for Estline, a joint Estonian-Swedish ferry operator. In the early 1990s, a period when newly independent Estonia was rapidly building commercial ties to Scandinavia after decades of Soviet control. The Tallinn-Stockholm route had become one of the busiest and most symbolically important crossings in the region, carrying not just tourists, but a steady flow of cargo and people rebuilding a country's economy almost from scratch. By 1994, she was operating the overnight route between Tallinn and Stockholm, a busy crossing for tourists, business travelers, and freight carrying cars and trucks on an enclosed deck below the passenger areas. Ferries of this design, roll-on, roll-off vessels, commonly called ro-ro ships, load vehicles through a massive hinged door at the bow, which then closes and locks before the ship sails. The design is efficient. It is also, by its very nature, vulnerable to one specific catastrophic failure mode. If that bow door fails at sea, water floods directly onto a single open deck with no internal compartments to slow it down. There are no walls down there, no bulkheads, just open space designed for cars that becomes a single enormous reservoir the moment the sea gets in. The British ferry Herald of Free Enterprise had already demonstrated exactly how deadly this design flaw could be. In March 1987, she capsized within minutes of leaving the Belgian port of Zeebrugge after her bow doors were left open by mistake. 193 people died. The disaster became one of the most studied maritime accidents in modern history, prompting new international safety standards for ro-ro vessels. The parallel with the Herald of Free Enterprise went beyond the basic mechanism of failure. In both cases, investigators later found that crew procedures around confirming the bow door's secure status before departure were inconsistent, dependent on individual habit rather than enforced foolproof protocol. In both cases, the open deck design meant that once water began entering, there was nothing internal to slow it down. No watertight compartments, no bulkheads, just a single uninterrupted space the length of the ship. Maritime engineers had warned for years, in technical journals and safety conferences, that this open deck design represented a known structural weakness across an entire generation of ro-ro ferries built through the 1970s and 1980s. The warnings produced procedural fixes. They did not produce a redesign of the ships already on the water. Those new standards focused heavily on procedures, checklists, confirmation protocols, indicator lights to show whether doors were properly closed. They focused less on the underlying mechanical strength of the locking systems themselves. The visor locks on ships like the Estonia remained largely the same hardware that had existed for years, designed to handle normal operational stress but not necessarily repeated, sustained battering from a genuine storm. On the night of September 27th into the 28th, 1994, the Baltic Sea was experiencing exactly that kind of storm. Winds were gusting at gale force. Waves were striking the bow repeatedly, with enough force that several crew members later recalled hearing loud, metallic banging sounds coming from the area around the visor. Sounds significant enough that they were mentioned in passing among the crew. No formal inspection of the visor was triggered by those reports. The ship maintained her scheduled speed through the rough water. Reducing speed in a storm like this would have been a standard precaution on many vessels. It reduces the force of wave impacts on the hull and bow structures. The Estonia did not significantly reduce hers. Just after 1 a.m, the locking mechanisms holding the visor in place finally failed under the cumulative stress of hours of wave impacts. The visor, a structure weighing many tons, tore away from the bow entirely. Without the visor in place, the inner bow ramp behind it was directly exposed to the sea, and that ramp had never been designed to be watertight on its own. Water began pouring directly onto the open car deck within seconds. Not a leak. A flood. Hundreds of tons of seawater sloshing across a single open deck with no internal walls to contain it, immediately destabilizing the entire ship. Within minutes, the Estonia developed a severe list to starboard. The list got worse. Then it became unrecoverable. The first distress call from the Estonia reached Finnish and Swedish maritime authorities just after 1:20 a.m. though survivors later disputed exactly how much time passed between the visor's failure and any organized attempt to alert nearby vessels. Several ships in the area, including the passenger ferry Mariella, altered course immediately and began searching the dark water for survivors, working against gale force winds and waves reported at several meters high. Finnish and Swedish military helicopters joined the search within the hour. But the same storm conditions that had doomed the Estonia made hoisting survivors out of the water an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous operation. Many of the 137 people ultimately rescued owed their survival to having reached one of the ship's life rafts, which offered at least partial protection from the worst of the cold compared to direct exposure in the open sea, where hypothermia could become fatal within 20 to 30 minutes. What happened inside the ship over the following 30 to 40 minutes was, by every survivor account, a scene of complete chaos in near total darkness. As the list increased, walking became impossible in most corridors. Floors became walls. Stairwells turned into vertical shafts. Furniture, luggage, and people slid and tumbled in the direction of the tilt. Many passengers were asleep in cabins below deck when the emergency began, and by the time the severity became clear, the angle of the ship made reaching the upper decks an extraordinarily difficult physical challenge, climbing what had become, in effect, a steeply pitched, moving wall. The crew attempted to issue a Mayday call, but accounts of exactly when and how clearly that distress signal went out have been disputed for years. What is clear is that nearby ships and rescue helicopters responded as quickly as conditions allowed, but the storm itself hampered the rescue effort. High waves and strong winds made helicopter recovery of people from the water extremely difficult and dangerous for the rescue crews themselves. The ship rolled completely onto her side and began to sink in well under an hour from the time the visor first failed. Survivors who managed to reach the upper deck and jump into the sea faced near freezing water temperatures, which by themselves can cause incapacitation within minutes. Of the 989 people on board, only 137 survived. 852 did not. Survivors who made it off the ship described an experience closer to climbing through a building falling sideways than escaping a sinking boat in any conventional sense. Corridors became chimneys. Stairwells turned into near vertical climbs over furniture, luggage, and other passengers, many of them in pure darkness after the ship lost power within minutes of the flooding beginning. Several survivors later credited their escape to pure chance, being awake rather than asleep, being in a cabin closer to an exterior door, being physically capable of climbing what had become an obstacle course, tilted at a deadly angle. The randomness of who lived and who didn't became one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of survival for many of the 137 people who made it out. The official joint investigation conducted by Estonia, Finland, and Sweden took years to complete. Its conclusion centered on the mechanical failure of the bow visor locks under storm conditions, compounded by the ship's vulnerable open-deck design and what the report characterized as inadequate crew response to the early warning signs, the banging noises, the failure to reduce speed, the lack of inspection. In 1995, the three governments signed an international agreement designating the wreck site a protected grave. Diving without explicit governmental permission became a criminal offense. The stated reason was respect for the dead. Many bodies were never recovered, remaining inside the ship on the seafloor. The practical effect was that for 25 years, almost no independent examination of the wreck took place. That changed in 2019 when a documentary production team working with a Swedish broadcaster used an unmanned underwater vehicle to film the wreck, technically permitted under specific rules. But the footage they captured reopened questions nobody expected. The footage showed a hole in the hull on the starboard side, roughly 4 meters across, in a location and configuration that some maritime experts argued was difficult to explain through the bow visor floating scenario alone. The discovery triggered new criminal investigations in Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. Investigations that, after years of work, ultimately did not find conclusive evidence overturning the original explanation, but also did not fully explain the whole to everyone's satisfaction. The renewed attention also revived decades-old rumors that had circulated quietly within Scandinavian defense and intelligence circles since the early 1990s. Rumors suggesting that ferries on the Tallinn-Stockholm route had, at various points, been used to discreetly transport former Soviet military equipment out of the newly independent Baltic states. Equipment that Western intelligence services had reason to want examined. Whether the Estonia herself was carrying anything unusual on the night she sank has never been proven. Multiple government reviews have stated they found no evidence supporting the theory. The persistence of the rumor itself, more than a quarter century later, says something about how incomplete the public felt the original explanation was. The 2019 documentary footage prompted formal reinvestigation by all 3 governments involved in the original inquiry, an unusual step nearly a quarter century after the case had been considered closed. Investigators used modern sonar and underwater photography technology unavailable in 1994 to re-examine the wreck in far greater detail than the original investigation had been capable of. The renewed inquiry, completed in 2023, ultimately concluded that the hole in the hull was most likely caused by the wreck's own structural collapse and seabed impact over decades, rather than evidence of an external collision or explosion. That conclusion did not fully satisfy survivor advocacy groups and independent researchers, several of whom continued to argue that the original investigation's scope had been too narrow from the start. What the renewed inquiry did not dispute was the core finding from 1997 that the visor locks failed under storm stress, and that the warning signs in the hours before the failure went unexamined. What remains undisputed is simpler and in some ways more damning: a known design vulnerability, a known prior disaster with the same failure mode 7 years earlier. Hours of warning sounds that nobody investigated, a speed that was never reduced, and a law passed the year after the disaster that made it a crime to look too closely at what was left. If you want to understand the disasters where the warning signs were heard, recorded, and then ignored anyway, and the questions that governments decided by law should stop being asked, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.